Four numbers just dropped publicly and settled something two sides of the internet have been arguing about for 2 straight years. $528,000. Music, $574,000. $493,000. $350,000. Music, no social media poll produced those figures. No debate segment on ESPN generated them. No fan vote. No viral moment. No podcast take. A collective bargaining agreement ran a formula performance algorithm process 2 years of verified professional production across multiple players, applied a set of contractual conditions that both sides agreed to and printed those four numbers onto an official salary document. And the moment that document went public, Angel Reese's response told every brand, every league executive, and every sponsor currently evaluating women's basketball exactly what they needed to know about how she handles market signals she doesn't like. But before we get to the response, you need to understand the mechanism, because the salary gap between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is not the story everyone is making it out to be. The gap is a symptom. The story is the system that produced it. And once you understand how that system actually operates, the entire conversation around these two players changes completely. There's a clause buried inside the new WNBA collective bargaining agreement that most people covering this story haven't taken the time to fully explain. It doesn't care about your social following. Music, it doesn't factor in how many times your name trended on Twitter. It doesn't respond to public pressure campaigns or viral moments, or which player the algorithm decided to push that week. It ties your contract value directly and exclusively to your verified all WNBA production during your rookie contract window. Clark, Music triggered that clause. Reese didn't. That is the entire mathematical explanation for a $178,000 base salary gap. And the more clearly you understand how it works, the harder it becomes to look at Reese's public reaction and take Music, any part of it, seriously. The clause is called the EPIC Clause, Exceptional Performance on Initial Contract. It was written into the new CBA as a performance-based accelerator. The architects of this agreement spent years listening to criticism that the WNBA salary structure didn't adequately reward players who came in and produced at an elite level immediately. The old system moved everyone up at roughly the same pace regardless of output. A player who made 3 All-WNBA teams in her first 4 seasons was climbing the salary ladder at nearly the same rate as a player who contributed nothing beyond staying on the roster. That was the problem the EPIC Clause, Music, was designed to solve. The threshold is clear, and it doesn't leave room for interpretation. Earn all WNBA honors within your first 3 professional seasons, and the league places you on an accelerated path toward maximum contract eligibility. You move through the salary structure faster than the standard timeline allows. The language is intentionally constructed to reward demonstrable output, not potential, not reputation coming in from college, not draft position alone. Documented, verifiable, selection committee verified production at the professional level. Music, Clark earned first team All-WNBA in her rookie season. 1 year into her professional career, the clause was already triggered. The formula had everything it needed. The acceleration began immediately. What's important to understand here is that Clark is not the only player this clause has worked for. The system isn't built around one name. Aaliyah Boston is the evidence that removes any argument about favoritism from the conversation. Entirely, Boston's contract jump is the number that should be getting more attention in this discussion because it demonstrates the clause operating on a completely different player profile with completely different circumstances and producing exactly the result the CBA architects intended. Music, she went from $94,000 to $574,000. That is not a raise in any conventional sense of the word. That is a formal contractual reclassification of her entire professional value based on 2 seasons of documented verifiable production. Back-to-back All-WNBA selections across her first 2 professional seasons combined with the kind of two-way impact that fundamentally restructured how Indiana runs both sides of the floor. Her presence changed the defensive coverages opponents had to deploy. It changed the post-entry angles available on offense. It changed the rebounding dynamics that every team in the league had to account for when they game planned against Indiana. The selection committee doesn't make those decisions lightly. They're evaluating production metrics across the entire league simultaneously. When Boston earned consecutive All-WNBA selections, The clause triggered and the salary document reflected it. $94,000 to $574,000. Music, the system working exactly as its designers intended it to work. That context matters enormously when you look at where Reese landed, because the argument that the formula is rigged, or that it favors Clark specifically, evaporates the moment you put Boston's number on the table next to it. The clause doesn't have a name preference. It has a production threshold, and it applies that threshold uniformly across every player it evaluates. Music Reese came into the league as the 7th overall pick in the 2024 draft. That draft position did real work for her immediately. It placed her above the baseline salary floor and moved her from $75,000 as a rookie to $350,000. Draft slot matters in the WNBA's new structure, and her position in that draft gave her a meaningful head start over players selected later. Music, but here's where the draft slot reaches its limit. It carries you to a certain point, and then it stops. The second accelerator, the epic clause pathway, requires all WNBA honors. The draft slot doesn't satisfy that condition. Performance does. Music, and through 2 full professional seasons, Reese has not earned a single all-WNBA selection. At any level, not second team, not third team, nothing. That is not a media characterization. That is a selection committee decision made by people who evaluate production metrics across every player in the league using a defined set of criteria. Their job is to identify which players performed at the highest level during that season. After 2 full seasons of professional basketball, that committee has not identified Reese as one of those players. And here's where the salary sheet becomes genuinely uncomfortable for anyone in the Reese camp who wants to frame this as an outsider issue or a Clark favoritism story. Cameron Brink, the 2nd overall pick from that same 2024 draft class, is sitting at $493,000. Sonia Kitchell, the 3rd overall pick from that same class, is at $436,000. Music, Reese, selected 7th overall, sits below both of them at $350,000. Her own draft class is outpacing her salary. Music, players selected above her in the same draft have climbed higher on the contract ladder after the same amount of professional time. That fact landed publicly in the exact same week Reese decided to go loudest about the gap between her number and Clark's number. The timing didn't help her argument. It undermined it completely. To understand how 2 players arriving in the professional league in different draft classes ended up with such dramatically different financial trajectories after only a short window of professional time, you have to go back further than the new CBA. You have to go back to where the divergence actually started, because it didn't start in a contract negotiation room. It started in college, and it was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Clark arrived at the records in a playmaking profile that scouts had been dissecting for years before she ever set foot in a WNBA facility. Her college production wasn't volume for volume's sake. It was a specific kind of offensive orchestration that changed how defenses structure their game plans at the national level. Teams weren't just trying to stop Clark from scoring. They were trying to solve a playmaking system that made everyone around her better simultaneously. That's a different problem to defend against, and it required a different level of game plan construction than most college players ever generate. When she stepped into the WNBA, she didn't arrive and coast on that reputation. She went out and documented entirely new production at the professional level. Rookie records in assists, scoring, and playmaking. Efficiency. First team All-WNBA in year 1. An All-Star selection. A Team USA roster spot where her assist efficiency and scoring output put her in direct comparison with the best players in the world, not just the best players in the league. Every single one of those milestones was tracked, verified, documented, and eventually reflected in a contract formula that cares only about what you actually produced on the floor. Reese's first 2 professional seasons told a meaningfully different story. The headline was rebounding. She was grabbing boards at rates that generated attention, and the box score totals looked substantial on the surface. But when analysts went deeper into the underlying numbers, the picture complicated quickly. A significant portion of her offensive rebound totals came directly off her own missed field goal attempts. In Season 2, she shot 39% from the field overall. She converted below 50% on attempts within 5 feet of the basket. From 5 to 9 feet, the conversion rate dropped to 13%. Her layup conversion rate was 31% in a season where she attempted the third most layups in the entire WNBA. That percentage is not a minor inefficiency. It's a structural problem. In her offensive game that generates the missed attempts, music that then produce a portion of the rebound total she's credited with. The rebounds look substantial in the box score. The shots that created the opportunity for those rebounds tell a very different story about what her presence was actually contributing to her team's offensive efficiency. Music Clark's production, meanwhile, was generating effects that never showed up in her own box score at all. And that's the part of the analytical picture that makes the comparison between these two players so one-sided when you, music, move beyond surface-level statistics. Defenses across the WNBA couldn't afford to sag off Clark without immediately conceding open three-point attempts from one of the most consistent long-range shooters in the league. That defensive imperative opened driving lanes for Kelsey Mitchell that she wouldn't have seen against a conventional defense. Music, it cleaned up post-entry angles for Aaliyah Boston that disappear when defenses don't have to respect the three-point line the way they do against Clark. Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull were seeing wide-open perimeter looks regularly because two defenders were tracking Clark's movement without the ball. She was pulling defensive attention away from teammates who were standing in open space ready to shoot. That kind of gravitational offensive impact doesn't register in any individual stat line. You won't find it in Clark's points per game, her assists column, or her shooting percentage. You find it in Indiana's win totals. Music, you find it in the defensive game plan construction that every opposing coaching staff had to develop before they played Indiana. You find it in the assist numbers of Clark's teammates, who were getting easier looks than they would generate on any other roster in the league. The All-WNBA Selection Committee evaluates exactly that kind of systemic influence alongside the individual production numbers. They're looking at what a player's presence does to an entire team's operation both offensively and defensively. And Clark's influence on Indiana's operation in year one was significant enough that the committee named her first team without hesitation. Snorts. The availability dimension added another layer to the comparison that the commercial world was watching very closely. Reese's injury situation in her second professional season stretched across months of vague day-to-day updates with no specific medical timeline attached to any of them. During that same stretch, she appeared publicly at promotional events for her Reebok line, while still officially listed as sidelined by the Chicago Sky. That contrast, publicly promoting a shoe deal while your team lists you as unavailable to play basketball, wasn't invisible to the brands tracking both players for long-term investment decisions. Organizations and individuals who handle themselves with transparency during difficult situations build trust with commercial partners. Organizations and individuals who create ambiguity around their availability while remaining publicly active for commercial purposes create a different kind of signal entirely. Indiana's communication around every health situation involving Clark during the season was immediate and specific. That behavioral contrast between the two organizations wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. What the Epic Clause essentially did when the new CBA salary numbers dropped publicly was produce the first official document in the Clark-Reese story that neither side can reframe through a media narrative. It isn't an opinion piece. It isn't a hot take from a commentator with an agenda. It isn't a ranking generated by fan voting or engagement metrics. It is a contractual outcome generated by a performance algorithm that both sides of the WNBA's labor negotiation agreed to in writing. And when Reese saw that document, her response revealed something important, not just about how she handles setbacks, but about what she understands and doesn't understand about the mechanism that produced the number she's reacting to. But before we get into that response and what it means commercially, the endorsement picture needs to be fully on the table because the $178,000 base salary gap between Clark and Reese becomes almost a footnote the moment you widen the frame to include what's happening simultaneously in the endorsement market. There's a parallel financial gap running alongside the CBA numbers, and it isn't measured in thousands. It's measured in tens of millions. Nike examined Clark's two-season professional arc and made a decision, not based on how many times her name trended, not based on social media following size or engagement rate. They examined arena attendance figures, television ratings, movement across her first two professional seasons, and merchandise velocity at the retail level. Music. They looked at whether her name was actually moving product at scale and at a pace that justified a long-term bet. The result was an 8-year, $28 million footwear partnership. Nike has been in the business of identifying generational commercial assets since Michael Jordan. They have more than 40 years of data on what those athletes look like at the early stages of their commercial trajectory. Music. They know the signals. They know the difference between a player who generates attention and a player whose name actually converts consumer behavior at scale. They looked at 2 years of Clark's professional data and committed 8 years of partnership. That's not a marketing experiment. That's a conviction bet from the most sophisticated footwear brand in the history of professional sports. Gatorade's partnership is reported at $50 million, and they didn't just sign Clark to a standard endorsement deal. Music. They built a signature flavor line around her, a flavor called Rainbow 3. The rainbow bottles hit retail and sold out fast enough that the sellout velocity itself became a separate news cycle. Independent of anything basketball-related, Gatorade does not construct signature flavors for athletes who are trending on social media. They build them around athletes whose names generate verifiable consumer demand at scale and at a speed that their distribution infrastructure can actually measure in real time. The sellout confirmed Clark's name does exactly that. Music, and according to people familiar with the campaign, the speed at which the product moved surprised even the most optimistic internal projections Gatorade had built before launch. State Farm entered the partnership from a completely different angle than Nike or Gatorade. The company has been building national advertising campaigns since 1922, over a century of advertising history. Across every major cultural shift in American sports and media, across the rise of television, the cable era, the internet age, and the social media transformation of how brands reach consumers. Music. They never once signed a female athlete to anchor their brand nationally. Then Clark's audience data landed on their desk, and a century-long streak ended. A company that spent over 100 years establishing its advertising identity in one direction looked at the commercial data attached to Clark's name and changed course. State Farm isn't a trendy brand chasing a viral moment. They're an insurance company that runs actuarial projections on everything they do. When actuaries decide to change a 100-year-old advertising strategy, they do it because the numbers gave them no other rational choice. Wilson Sporting Goods built a complete signature line around Clark. The last athlete in their entire history to receive that specific treatment was Michael Jordan. Music. Not another active WNBA player, not a current NBA franchise player generating championship-level attention, Michael Jordan. Wilson reviewed their entire catalog of brand partnerships, spanning more than a century of history, and concluded that Clark's commercial pull justified doing what they last did for the most commercially dominant athlete in the history of professional basketball. The fact that they drew that internal comparison and then acted on it tells you more about Clark's actual market position than any individual salary number, ranking, or media designation ever could. That portfolio, Nike, Music, Gatorade, State Farm, Wilson, represents a level of simultaneous brand investment that has no direct precedent in the history of women's basketball. Every single brand on that list had other options. Every one of them evaluated the available field, and Music chose Clark. The commercial world doesn't make $100 million worth of collective decisions based on sentiment or social media metrics. It makes them based on data. Music, and the data attached to Clark's name across 2 professional seasons produced a response from the market that no one in women's basketball has ever generated before. Reebok made a different calculation. They signed Reese, invested genuine marketing energy into the launch, built distribution infrastructure around the product, and executed a campaign with real promotional momentum behind it. Then they watched the shoe sit on shelves for months without selling through at the rate the investment required. The marketing spend began contracting quietly. Advertisements stopped running. The shoe moved into discounted retail positioning, while Reebok went almost completely silent on the entire campaign. Brands do not let campaigns go silent when those partnerships are performing. They increase spend. They build on momentum. They announce follow-up products. They put the athlete in more campaigns, not fewer. Music. Silence in the endorsement world is not a neutral signal. It is a direct communication from the sales data to the marketing team that the investment is not generating the return the brand needed it to generate. The commercial world has been reading that signal from the Reese Reebok situation for a while now. The public trajectory of that partnership, from launch momentum and genuine promotional energy to retail markdown and organizational silence, music is one of the clearest market verdicts available in the current WNBA endorsement landscape. And it didn't happen because of bad luck or bad timing. It happened because the consumer data told Reebok something about Reese's name value that the launch energy had initially obscured. Forbes ranked Clark fourth on their most powerful women in sports list. That ranking is built on revenue generation data and brand impact metrics. It is not a fan vote. It is not a social media engagement calculation. It is a data methodology applied to commercial output. Sportico named her the most influential female athlete of 2025 using the same data-first approach. When Clark appears that high on both lists music simultaneously, it's because the commercial numbers attached to her name are genuinely that large. Her front row seat at a Prada runway show alongside cultural figures operating at the highest level of fashion wasn't a courtesy placement. Fashion houses at that level allocate front row positioning to people who generate press coverage and move product for the brand. Clark earned that seat because her cultural reach has extended into spaces that have no direct relationship to basketball whatsoever. Reese's public response to the Forbes ranking and the Prada moment followed a pattern that anyone who has tracked this rivalry since their college days will recognize immediately. The same public dismissiveness that characterized her reactions throughout the Iowa LSU chapter of this story carried directly into the professional era without modification. Brands track that behavioral pattern specifically because they run sentiment analysis on how an athlete's public conduct affects the perception of the brands commercially associated with them. They evaluate whether an athlete's public behavior creates liability over time. They look at consistency, professionalism, and the ability to handle competitive adversity with the kind of grace that makes long-term investment feel safe. Reese's track record on that specific metric has been consistently problematic, and the commercial world has been quietly adjusting its positioning around that reality for the better part of 2 full professional seasons. The Reebok situation is the most publicly visible data point, but it is not the only one that commercial decision-makers are aware of. Clark's response to every public confrontation Reese has initiated over the past 2 years has been functionally identical every single time. Play basketball at a level that generates all WNBA selections. Show up for Team USA. Continue signing brand partnerships. Give interviews that reinforce the image of a competitor who is focused entirely on performance and output. That behavioral consistency isn't accidental, and it isn't just good PR management. It is a specific and measurable commercial asset. Brands writing 8-year commitments and $50 million need confidence that the person they're attaching their identity to won't generate liability events that damage their brand. They need to know that the athlete they're investing in will handle adversity with professionalism, will stay focused on performance during public pressure, and will not force them into awkward positions where their brand's name is attached to a controversy the brand didn't sign up for. Clark's public track record answers that question clearly and consistently. Every time Reese has attempted to create a public confrontation, Clark has responded by doing something on the floor or in the endorsement market that reinforces exactly the qualities her brand partners need to see. Sponsors currently evaluating Reese's commercial potential have been watching her public behavior accumulate across 2 professional seasons. Every public reaction she makes gets logged. Every one of them either builds or erodes the brand conversation she attempts to have next. When the CBA salary document dropped and Reese chose a public grievance over a measured response, every brand watching that unfold in real time got a fresh, high-visibility data point about how she handles market signals that don't go in her favor. Music, that data point doesn't exist in isolation. It exists alongside every other public reaction she's produced since arriving in the professional music league. And the cumulative picture those reactions paint is one that makes long-term investment feel risky rather than safe. When the salary numbers dropped publicly, Reese went on social media and stated she deserves $1 million in base salary. Take a moment with that statement and everything surrounding it simultaneously. Not a measured critique of how the Epic Clause threshold is structured. Not a public acknowledgement that earning an all-WNBA selection is the specific mechanism that would trigger the salary acceleration she's looking for. not a commitment to doing the on-court work required to satisfy the clause conditions in the 2026 season. A direct, unqualified public demand for $1 million. From a player whose signature shoe was sitting at markdown pricing at retail, whose all-WNBA resume is completely empty after 2 full professional seasons, and whose primary endorsement partner had been quietly pulling back its marketing investment and organizational commitment for months before that statement was ever made. The timing made the demand land harder than it otherwise would have on its own. Music, the salary document, the Forbes ranking, the Sportico designation, and the ongoing Gatorade sellout story all arrived in the same news cycle simultaneously. Nike, Gatorade, State Farm, and Wilson were watching Reese respond to all of it in real time. What they observed confirmed the investment thesis they had already acted on. The brands that were already cautious about Reese's public behavior now had a fresh, high-visibility, completely voluntary data point to add to the file they'd been building over 2 seasons. And the brands that might have been on the fence about her commercial potential got a clear, unambiguous signal about how she handles competitive adversity in a public forum. Here's what the demand actually revealed beyond the obvious headline. Music. It revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what produces salary value in the new CBA structure. The Epic Clause doesn't respond to public statements about what you believe you deserve. It responds to all WNBA production. The path to $1 million in WNBA base salary runs music directly through an all WNBA selection. That is the mechanism. That is the only mechanism. A social media post demanding $1 million doesn't interact with the formula in any way whatsoever. It generates attention, it generates headlines, and it generates a fresh data point for every brand evaluating your commercial reliability. But it doesn't move your contract number by a single dollar. Here's the forward-looking reality that the current numbers don't fully capture yet. Music, because the Epic Clause is not a fixed outcome for anyone, it's an accelerating engine. And the trajectory it has set Clark on makes Reese's $1 million demand look even more disconnected from the financial reality that's actually unfolding. Music, Clark's $528,000 base salary, is not a ceiling. It is a way station on a contractual path that the clause structure has already mapped out. She's on track for maximum contract eligibility by 2027 based solely on her first team All-WNBA selection from year 1 of her professional career. If she earns All-WNBA honors again in 2026, and her first 2 seasons make that a structurally reasonable expectation rather than speculation, the next escalator in the clause structure activates. Analysts who have modeled her contract trajectory based on the new CBA structure have her approaching a potential supermax contract worth $1.7 million annually by 2028. Reese publicly demanded $1 million. Clark is contractually positioned to more than double that number within the same time frame. Music, and the gap between their contract numbers, doesn't hold at $178,000. It widens with each season Clark performs at her current output level. Music, it widens with each season Reese doesn't earn an All-WNBA selection. The math doesn't stabilize in Reese's favor at any point on the current trajectory. It moves in one direction, and it moves there consistently. Indiana, heading into 2026 with Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, and Sophie Cunningham Music, all under contract, is not a fringe championship conversation. It is a legitimate title contention discussion that the entire league is going to have to prepare for. A franchise paying Clark $528,000 in base salary while she pulls $28 million in Nike partnerships and $50 million in Gatorade arrangements into the women's basketball conversation at the same time as getting in. Extraordinary return on that contract number. Music, the league built the Epic Clause to reward production. Indiana built a roster around the player who triggered it first. The results of both decisions are going to compound over the next several years in ways the current salary document only partially reflects. Every young player coming through college basketball right now can see exactly where each path leads. They can look at 2 players who entered professional basketball in different draft classes, both coming in with massive expectations and significant public profiles, and trace what happened when they actually started producing at the professional level. One player documented 62 collegiate records, triggered a performance clause in her first professional season, and sign with brands that made their decisions based on actual sales data and verified consumer behavior. The other player went on social media and demanded $1 million. 5 years ago, the combination of a $528,000 WNBA base salary, a $28 million Nike deal, a $50 million Gatorade partnership, and a Wilson signature line was not something any female basketball player could realistically project toward as a professional outcome. Those numbers didn't exist in women's basketball. Clark didn't receive them because of hype or viral timing, music, or because the algorithm decided to push her name in a particular direction during a particular month. She received them because she documented production, triggered a performance clause, and signed with brands that ran their analysis on hard commercial data. Music. The market didn't pick a side in this debate. It didn't choose aesthetics or storyline, or which player the internet preferred in a given moment. It ran music, the numbers, and the numbers produced a result that a public demand on social media isn't going to change. Not this season, not next season, not at any point before the Epic Clause either. Gets triggered through documented all WNBA production, or it doesn't. The formula is clear. The path is clear. The only question that remains is whether the player who needs to walk that path, music, understands what it actually requires, or whether she'll keep telling the market what she thinks she deserves while the market continues telling her something completely different in return. The gap between those two conversations is $178,000 today. Music. By 2028, if current trajectories hold, it will be measured in millions, music, and no social media post is going to close it.